Today we're looking at part 3 in our series on the qualifications of elders. And just want to say I appreciate you all being patient with me and putting up with me as I'm going through these pretty meticulously. We're going to try to finish up the rest of the qualifications except for not a novice, and then dealing the qualifications that deal with the family of an elder. And of course then next week, Lord willing, we'll deal with that and try to get through it. I'm going to warn you beforehand, I've got 2 slides. So when I get to the end of the first one, don't think, what's wrong with Clint? He's short-winded this morning, or don't think, okay, it's all over, right? So I'm going to pre-warn you, I'm going to prepare you for that. We're going to have 2 different slides, so don't get too excited at the end of number 1. But, you know, we're looking at things that according to 1 Timothy 3:3 and Titus 1:7, an elder must be. And again, we want to emphasize the need for elders. You know, it doesn't justify us trying to dismiss any of these qualifications. It doesn't justify us trying to reduce them in any way. But just because the office is such an important office, it doesn't justify us in that case to make them stricter than what God has made them. And so we've got to be careful that we don't develop this attitude of picking us, where we make these qualifications unapproachable, you know, where they require a sinlessly perfect man or superhuman individual to enter into that office. And hopefully what you've seen as we've gone through the past 2 lessons and as we go through this one this morning is in these areas that we've talked about, an elder is to be no different than us. He's to be no different than what we would look at and observe as a faithful Christian of God. And so don't try to take these qualifications and elevate them to a stage where they're unattainable, or else you're elevating all of us to that same stage. God requires of elders that they are faithful. And there are certain things that he points out that they must be qualified in, not things that they'll grow into, but whenever they're appointed into this office, things that they must be. So we've looked at some of these throughout this series, and again, I'm going to emphasize these are in no particular order. I've just kind of picked them out as we've gone through them and mixed them up, or tried to mix them up as best I can, where we're not just repeating ourselves over and over again. But the first qualifications that we want to talk about today is the one that's not greedy of filthy lucre. And of course, that's translated that way in the King James Version in 1 Timothy 3 and verse 3. The word not is actually not part of this one word, but greedy of filthy lucre is one word in the original language. And it's also pointed out in Titus chapter 1 and verse 7. So what does this word mean? Well, the root word of this, it's like so many of these words that we've studied, it's really a compound word. But the root word refers to something that is indecent, something that is distasteful, or something that is ugly. We might even say something that is dirty. And so when you think of something that's dirty, what do you mean by that? Well, sometimes we talk about dirty money. You know, we're not talking about the physical appearance of the money itself, but we're talking about the means, the medium by which this money was gained. And so if you have dirty money, that means that you've gained this in an unclean or a distasteful or an ugly way. We might even say in a dishonest way. And so an elder is not to be greedy of getting things in a dishonest way, of attaining things in a distasteful or an ugly manner. And I think that the emphasis is really on elders not making, what is their goal in life? What is their first aim? What is their chief desire? Well, if it's to gain, if it's to prosper in this physical world, then that's going to create problems within the Lord's church, because truth is sometimes, you know, of a nature that it actually pushes people away, or people allow it to push them away, rather than being attractive to people. And so if their idea of a prosperous church is one that has inflated numbers, if they want it to be all about physical things, then what are they going to do? Well, they're going to compromise the truth in order to attain that. And so it's this idea of not a person who's out to get, but a person who's out to give. And that's what an elder is really supposed to be. When you think about what keeps the church, the Lord's church, from growing today, and what hinders the gospel from being spread like it should. One of the things, if I were to make a list of things in my mind as to what does that, one of the things that I would put at the top is worldliness in Christians. You know, it's this idea that Christians are living no different than the world is. And so if we're out here like the world, just trying to get everything that we can, and we're willing to do it in a distasteful way, in an ugly way, then that's not going to bring glory to God. And so we have to understand that elders are in a position too, where they're going to be the ones who are maybe not necessarily exchanging the money with hands, but dealing with the overseeing of the funds. And if in their mind the only thing that they're wanting is this physical gain, then they're going to spend that money in a way that's going to bring maybe physical uplifting and glory to the church here upon the earth, rather than spending it in a spiritual way as God intended. So their emphasis would be upon the physical and not really upon the spiritual. So what are they going to use the funds of the church for? Can they be trusted to use it in a wise way, in a spiritual manner? Or again, is it this idea that they're greedy of distasteful or ugly gain? Are they going to spend it very frivolously in order to build up physical things in the eyes of the people? And so an elder must not be greedy of filthy lucre. The next qualification that we want to look at, I didn't get all these in here. It's the same word that's used of deacons there in 1 Timothy 3 and verse 8. Like I said, it carries with it the idea of being dirty. I've got to go pretty quickly through some of these in order to get through them, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on them. The second qualification is patient, as it's translated again in the King James Version in 1 Timothy 3:3, or some versions translated as gentle. It's actually a compound word. The first part, epi, means of on or unto, and then the second part of it, akos, means probable or reasonable. And so it's this idea, a lot of translations will translate it as being suitable or fitting. And that's really a good translation, I think, of this original word. Now, is it this characteristic, again, that's just to be shown by elders? Well, no. We learn from Titus 3 and verse 2 that it was a quality that Titus, as a young preacher, was to teach all Christians to possess. And within that particular passage in the King James Version, that's the word that's translated gentle in that same passage. It's also translated, if you look at Philippians 4 and verse 5, it's translated as moderation there. It's the word, Paul says, let your moderation be known unto all men. Again, he's not just writing to elders, but he's writing to the entire church at Philippi. And it's kind of a pretty versatile word in the original language when you look at it, because you might look at Philippians 4:5 there and think, well, why did they translate it as moderation? Well, that's really, when you read the classical Greek writings, that's really the way that they normally translated this word. And so moderation carries with it this idea of yielding or being reasonable. We might even say even being considerate. And so what it's talking about is being considerate toward all men. Let your consideration be known or shown toward all men. Now, I want to emphasize that within the passage here we're reading in Philippians 4 and verse 5, that this gentle and forbearing attitude in our dealings with mankind was not to just be shown toward those within the church, toward our fellow Christians, our brothers and sisters in Christ. Paul says, let your moderation be known unto all men. And so it's a gentle, forbearing way that you interact and you deal with people, not only within the church, but also without the church. And so how would you contrast that? Well, I would say the contrast to that might be being overly critical of people. It might be over-condemning people, or even ignoring the wishes and the desires that other people may have. And so this moderation is something that all men should see, both within and without the church. Now, we know we're not supposed to be parading around our spiritual attributes just to put them on show for men, but it is something that's supposed to be seen in our everyday life. James wrote in James 3 and verse 17, the wisdom that comes from above. One of the things that he describes, this wisdom that comes from above, is gentle. That's our word there that we're talking about. So it's the idea of dealing with people in a gentle, in a considerate, in a very caring way. And of course, God wants that not only of elders, but also of all of us as Christians today. The third thing that we're going to look at this morning is not a brawler. And we talked just a little bit about this idea or this concept last week from a verbal standpoint. I think this word in the original language has more of a physical idea to it. And some versions translate it not a fighter. But certainly there are some people who are just contentious people. There are some people who are just looking to fight with somebody else, and it doesn't matter whether it's physical or verbal or, I don't know, any other kind of fighting that a person might engage in. An elder is not supposed to be that kind of person. So, not quarrelsome. In Titus chapter 3 and verse 2, again, it's not just something that's supposed to be a unique quality of elders, but it's something that Titus was to teach all Christians to possess there. And of course, it's translated there to be no brawlers. God doesn't want us to be contentious people here upon this earth. You know, over and over again, the Bible teaches to us this idea of peace and promoting unity and harmony. And so, does God want us to stand up for the truth? Well, yes, absolutely. But He doesn't want us to just go around and be picking fight or looking for a fight with every person that we run into or we encounter. And so elders are not to be brawlers, but again, it's not just a characteristic that's limited to elders. It's also supposed to be said of all Christians. The fourth idea that we're going to look at today is not covetous, or some versions translate it not greedy. It's actually 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 3. It's a negative compound word, which the first part of that word is philos. That's a word that we've read several times, which means love. And the second part of that word is argyros, which literally means silver. But by implication, it carries with it the idea of money. And so, literally, we would translate it, not a lover of money. Now, the opposite form of this root word, it's the same root word, but it doesn't have the negative participle attached to it all in the beginning of the Greek language. But the opposite form of it is found in 1 Timothy 6 and verse 9. And I want you to think about this passage as I read it to you. I am actually going to start in verse 9 and read through verse 10 there. But Paul said, "They that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For," listen to this is our word, "the love of money. For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows." That's our word that is translated here as not covetous, or some versions translate it not greedy. Not literally not a lover of money. And so when you think about Paul's summation of what happens to people who love money, well, he said those people who want to be rich, they're going to fall into temptations. They're going to fall into many traps or snares that Satan has set for them. They're going to do foolish things. They're going to say foolish things in order to gain money. He also talks about how they're going to fall into many situations that's going to cause hurtful things to them, physical harm to themselves. You know, when I read these verses, I always think and ask the question, what will people do for money today? Well, really the question should be, what will they not do, right? Because people will do anything for money. Will they cause physical harm to themselves if it brings them money? Absolutely. Will they do many foolish things? They surely will, won't they? They'll do all kinds of things. Are they going to fall into temptation because of it? Yes, Satan's going to tempt them because of this desire that they have. And then he goes on to talk about, well, I guess I should say that phrase, the love of money is the root of all evil. That's not really a good translation, because There's some things that are evil that are not caused by a love of money. But I think a better rendition of that, as some translations put it, is the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. I mean, think about today, all sorts of evil that grow in the world today, and they grow out of this desire for people to have money. This obsession that people have with money. There's all sorts of evil that take place in our world today because of this desire. And so it's not something that you want within a person who is leading the Lord's church and who is setting an example for the church to follow. But is it okay for all Christians to have this, but just elders have to stay away from it? Well, no. In fact, in Hebrews 13 and verse 5, we read here, let your conversation be, here's our word, without covetousness. And be content with such things as you have, for he has said, I will never leave thee, nor forsake thee. You know, Paul is emphasizing to first century Christians here, when it comes to being content in this world, how should we view our life? Should we be in love with possessions and money and gaining more and more as we live here upon this earth? Well, Paul said, let your desire be only what God has given to you. And don't covet other things that the providence and the power of God has seen fit to give to other people. And basically the summation of Hebrews 13:5 is, be satisfied with what God has given you. Don't covet things that God has given to everybody else. And the underlying reason behind all this is because God is yours. You belong to God. And so be content with being a child of God. Be content with heaven being your home and having the forgiveness of your sins. And so God should be enough for us. And if God is not enough for us, if that's not going to satisfy us, then it's going to open the door to all other kinds of evil, or all sorts of evil that happen within this life. And so again, it's not just a characteristic that should be said of elders in the Lord's church, but it's something that all of us as Christians should possess, not being covetous or greedy. The fifth thing, hope you didn't forget, we got 2 slides. The fifth thing that we're looking at this morning is a good report from without. 1 Timothy 3 and verse 7. And so what does that mean? Well, again, I did a little bit of root study or word study on this. And when you go back to classical Greek writings, what you'll find is this was actually a legal term. In other words, when I say a legal term, I mean it was a word that was used a lot in the courtroom situation. And it carries with it this idea of witness, or carries with it the idea of testimony, we might say. So it was either testimony or witnessing for or against somebody within a courtroom. In other words, you were standing up and you were saying something for or something against this person that was trying to be convicted of a certain crime. And so the question becomes this: what do people outside of the church, what do those who are not Christians think about these men? And that's important because, you know, as the church, the Lord's church here upon earth today, we don't want to give a bad name to the church or to Christ or to God. We don't want the church to develop a bad reputation within our community. Now, obviously, when we're talking about how people without view these men, you know, if they're godly men who are doing good things and people just don't like them because of that, that's great. That's really what we're talking about here. It's what kind of reputation, what kind of character do they have within the community itself. And so what we have to understand is obviously most of the time elders are going to work outside the church. They're going to work within their own community. They're probably going to work side by side with other people. And so is he living a Christian life? You know, does he have this reputation that, you know, he practices what he preaches, he's a good individual? Or do people look at him as his dealings with other people and say, well, that guy's a liar. Or that guy's a cheat. Every person who does something with them or does business with him, he cheats them out of something. Or this guy may pretend to be a Christian, but if you've ever been around him very much, you'll know that he has a pretty foul mouth. You know, the idea is the witness of the outside world to this man. Well, what would happen if you appoint a man to the office of the church who has this reputation in the community as being a liar or being a cheat or even being a foul-mouthed individual? Well, it's going to bring dishonor to the church, isn't it? It's going to bring dishonor to Christ and to Christianity in general. And so is his reputation such that it builds up the church, or it affects the church's influence in a good or in a positive way? You know, Satan today would want nothing more than our surrounding communities to think badly of the church here at Gospel Hill. And so one of the ways that could happen is if we appoint men to the office who are not living godly within our community. And so we have to have they have to have a good report from those who are without. You know, I was thinking about David in this particular instance and thinking about this idea of doing things that would dishonor the church. And I'm going to emphasize, it doesn't mean that he's a sinless person, that he's never done anything wrong, but what's his reputation? How is he living right now within that community? What kind of a reputation or rapport does he have with people outside the church? And remember David in the story of his sin with Bathsheba. Of course, we know that he committed murder, you know, he committed adultery. And remember that statement. I think of it a lot. But the statement that Nathan made to David, he said, "Howbeit, because by this deed thou hast given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, the child also that is born unto thee shall surely die." You know, what did David's actions, what kind of reputation did they reflect upon the children of God? What kind of reputation did they reflect upon the surrounding individuals and the surrounding communities and groups that we read about, the people that we read about? What kind of reputation did they cast upon the children of Israel? And what kind of reflection did that put upon God as God being David's God? Well, it brought shame upon him, didn't it? It brought dishonor. It created an atmosphere and an opportunity where people could speak evil about Jehovah God and about David and about Israel. And so that's what we don't want within the church. We don't want people who are doing things that would cause God's name to be blasphemed, that would bring a dishonorable reflection upon the Lord's church himself. And if you think about it, that's true of all Christians, isn't it? I mean, all of us can go out into our community and do things and develop a reputation that's going to reflect badly upon the Lord's church. And so again, it's not just something that should be said of elders. It's something that all of us as individuals should be reflecting. What are we on? Number 6 here or something like that. A lover of good. Actually, the King James Version says in Titus 1 and verse 8, a lover of good men. Men is not in the original language. It's something that was added by the translators for clarity. But literally it means a lover of good. And so it doesn't just apply to mankind, but it applies to anything that is good. What does that mean? Well, it means an elder is supposed to be a person who loves to do what is good and what is right. And he loves every good object. And he loves every good person. And he loves every good word that is spoken in honor and in glorification of Jesus Christ. And so he's a lover of good things. There's a contrast that is made in 2 Timothy 3 and verse 3. And this is again an opposite of what we're reading about of what an elder is supposed to be in Titus 1 and verse 8. But as Paul is writing there, he says, these people are without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce. Here's a big phrase, but it's only one word in the Greek language. Despisers of those that are good. So when you think about it from that standpoint, you know, a person who is a despiser of those that are good. There are people within the world today who despise doing good. They despise people who do good. They despise good things that are done. And when I'm talking about good, I'm talking about godly things. And their desire is they want nothing to do with those people. And they want nothing to do to be associated with the things that they're doing. They have no love, no honor, and no respect for those type of people and the type of things that they're doing. Well, an elder is supposed to be the opposite of that. An elder is supposed to be a lover of those things that are good. And so they love good works that are being done for the Lord. They love godly people. They love everything that takes place in the name of good. And so, consequently, he's going to be the type of person who surrounds himself with good things. You usually surround yourself with things that you love, right? Generally speaking, you don't take things that you hate and you surround yourself with them because it doesn't make you feel good. But you surround yourself with the things that you love. And so an elder is going to be surrounded by good things, by good people, and bring honor and glory to the Lord. Now again, you think about that, well, should that be true of all Christians? Sure. Not just something that should be said of elders, but all of us should love good works, and all of us should love good people, and all of us should be attracted to good things. The seventh thing that we're going to look at is the word just, as at least that's the way it's translated in the King James Version in Titus 1 and verse 8. This word means things that are lawful. We might even think of it, I think probably a better way to think of it is things that are according to justice. And when we think about, or we talk about justice in this setting, we're talking about things that God deems lawful and right. God's justice. And so an elder must be a person who is in accordance with God's law. He must be practicing things that God says are just and right. And it's really a relationship term when you look at its background. It's a relationship term that describes God's relationship with us, with mankind. There's a couple of good examples of this. Well, I'll just mention one for lack of time. But in Luke chapter 1 and verses 5 through 6. Remember there it says, there was in the days of Herod, the king of Judea, a certain priest named Zacharias, of the course of Abiah, and his wife was of the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. King James Version says, and they were both righteous. That word righteous is our same word in the original Greek language, just, in Titus 1 and verse 8. They were both righteous before the Lord. Now notice this, walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord, blameless. According to God's justice, they were right people, weren't they? What does that mean? That means they were walking according to God's law. They were doing what God had commanded them to do. It didn't mean that they never did anything wrong in their life, but they were living according to the commandments of God. And so we talked a little bit about this on Wednesday night. Our relationship to God is based upon what? Now, a lot of people will say love, and that's true. But according to God, that love is measured by the keeping of His commandments. And so if we want to be right in the sight of God, what do we have to do? We have to obey the gospel of Christ, don't we? If we want to be right in the sight of God, we have to do what God told us to do. We have to walk in His commandments. We have to keep His ordinances. And so it's not a rebellious person here, but it's a person who is just in God's law, in God's sight. And the reason he is just is because he's walking in the commandments and the ordinances of God. Remember John said in 1 John 2 and verses 3 through 4, he said, hereby we do know that we know Him if we keep His commandments. He that saith, I know Him, and keepeth not His commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. What is our relationship to God based upon? It's based upon the keeping of His commandments. And so if we walk in His commandments, if we keep His ordinances, we have a relationship with God. We are just in His sight. And again, is that something that should just be said of elders? Well, no. All of us, our relationship is dependent upon the keeping of God's commandments. Holy is another description that's given to Him in Titus 1 and verse 8. This is a word that's mainly used to describe deity. In Acts 2 and verse 27, talks about the Holy One, describing Jesus in that passage. But what does it mean? Well, one of the best displays of this word, I think, is found in 1 Timothy 2 and verse 8. Paul said there, he said, I will therefore that men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands, without wrath and doubting. What do holy hands represent? Well, it represents this idea of purity. It represents this idea of being free from sinful deeds. And think about it. Paul is talking about praying to God here. And so if we want God to hear our prayers, if we want God to answer our prayers, we don't want dirty hands, do we? We don't want to be out here living ungodly lives and doing ungodly things and constantly breaking His commandments and then come before God and expect Him to accept the prayer that we offer up. No, John says we know that we get the things that we ask of Him. Why? Because we keep His commandments and do those things that are pleasing in His sight. Holy hands. And so an elder is supposed to be a person who's doing what God commanded, who has that relationship that we talked about according to the law of God, based upon justice. And then the last thing that we want to look at in this particular lesson, to kind of finish up, at least until next week, we talk about those other things I mentioned. Titus 1 and verse 8, temperate. Temperate. And this is a hard one because this is the only time this word is used in the New Testament. I don't like those words because it makes it difficult for me to get a grasp and a correct bearing on those words. But again, what do you do when you're faced with something like that? You go back to Greek writings of those days and you look around a little bit and you see how the word was generally used in society. And so when you do that, you'll find that in classical Greek writings, again, the main idea of this word is the idea of power or lordship. It's the idea of being in control or having control. And what Paul is writing about here is an elder is supposed to be the master. He's supposed to be the Lord. He's supposed to have the power over his own body. In other words, he's supposed to be in control of his own body. He's not supposed to let his physical desires and passions dictate to him how he's going to live in this life and what he's going to say and whether he's going to keep God's commandments or not, but rather he's the Lord. He has the power over his own body. And so that's really the concept. You know, Paul wrote, and I like this illustration of Paul here in Romans 6, 12 through 13. He says, "Let not sin therefore reign in your mortal body, that ye should obey it in the lust thereof. Neither yield ye your members as instruments of unrighteousness unto sin, but yield yourselves unto God as those that are alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness unto God." Do you understand what Paul's saying there? He said, let not sin reign in your mortal bodies, that you should obey it. Should we let sin control us? Should we let sin be our Lord and our master, letting it reign, enthroning it in our lives, and allowing it to dictate what we're going to do with the members of our body? Well, we can't let sin have that type of authority or control over us. We're always supposed to be in control of our mortal bodies. And so Paul says here, don't let sin be your master. Don't let sin reign over you with its strong desires and its cravings and the pull that sin has. And I think all of us understand when we talk about the power and the appeal of sin. Listen, sin and the desire of sin is strong. It's appealing. It can rule over us. It can control our desire for money or property or positions in this life or pleasure or fleshly stimulations. But a Christian has control. A Christian is Lord over his own body. He is the master. And so sin doesn't have reign or control over him. The message or the qualification here for elders is a person who's in control, who is Lord over his own body. Now again, you think of that. Is that just elders? No, that's all Christians everywhere, isn't it? And so, as we kind of wrap all these up, I want to remind you, I think there's just this tendency often when we think of these qualifications of elders, we tend to think of them as being superhuman. You know, we tend to think of them as being untouchable in comparison to other Christians. But what we've read and what we've studied in all these qualifications, we're just talking about a faithful Christian, aren't we? We're not talking about anybody any different than what any Christian is supposed to be, except maybe in the area of ability to teach. Elder has to be pretty able to teach in order to do certain things. But beyond that, we're just talking about an ordinary Christian, friends. And so all these qualities are not just things that elders should possess, but all of us as Christians. And I hope